Our first speaker today will be Mr. Hedley Rees. Hedley founded PharmaFlow in 2005 and is managing consultant as well as being the author of Supply Chain Management in the Drug Industry. He has held senior positions at Bayer UK, British Biotech, Vernalis, Ortho Clinical Diagnostics, previously J&J, and OSI Pharmaceuticals, now Astellas. Hedley graduated from Cardiff University as a production engineer, holds a diploma in management studies from the University of South Wales, and an executive MBA from Cranfield University School of Management. Today, he will discuss with us what can the pharma industry learn from ISIA about supply chain traceability. And so now, here's Hedley.
So here we have my title slide here, just introducing you to the topic. And the title is, what can the pharma industry learn from ISIA about supply chain management traceability? And as I said before, I think there's quite a lot to be learned. This whole presentation is going to start with a big picture view of the industry and its supply chains and the various things that have gone on over the years that I want to explain to you about. And the first element of it is going through the agenda. So I'm going to explain to you what I'm calling my 4 phases of enlightenment. So that's life in big pharma biotech as an independent consultant in supply chain management and life sciences, and then as an author. Then I'm going to talk to you about outsourcing in pharmaceuticals, which has crucially fragmented supply chains over the years, and some of the other topics that we will talk to in this whole program of presentations. I think we'll look into that in some depth. Then I'll question how traceability has really been a difficult nut to crack, and how the issues can be traced to what goes on in research and development of new medicines and drugs. Then we talk about COVID-19, the topical issue at the moment, and there are lots of lessons to be learned on that. And one of them is the fact that traceability is something that the whole industry still needs to work hard at to get it absolutely right. And then I'll take some questions at the end. So my 4 phases of enlightenment. First, life in big pharma. So between 1980 and 1996, I worked at Bayer in the UK, manufacturing plant, making things like Alka-Seltzer, topical creams and ointments, and also sterile injectables, allergens, biologics effectively. And that's when I got to understand the difficulties of making biologics, the challenges faced, and we will talk about that significantly more later. What I should say at the start is, in those days, in the 1980s up to the mid-1980s, processing was pretty much integrated. So we would receive raw materials and starting materials into a goods receiving bay. They'd be processed through all stages to finished product, packaged finished product, and we'd send them out to wholesalers, hospitals, pharmacies in the UK, very much integrated. And what I'm going to talk about as we go through this is how that's changed over the years. So what I learned at Bayer was, particularly in relation to biologics, was the importance of cold chain management, the risk of temperature excursions, and how variation in potency and yield really can make supply chain management incredibly difficult when you're trying to manage supply and demand. One of the elements that I think we're going to be talking about here is how do you achieve upstream pedigree through the various stages in the supply chain. And hopefully some of what I'm going to say here is founded on that experience. 1996, I thought it was time for the move. I moved into biotech. Now, life in biotech, gosh, that was so different. Biotech, what I mean by biotech is a virtual company funded by venture capital, fully outsourced supply chain, staffed with scientists and technical and clinical people with the skills to bring drugs to market through the supply chain. The companies I worked for were aiming to bring the drug to market. And the first thing I noticed when I sat in project team meetings was, why are they starting with the raw materials and the starting materials and the intermediates? Why aren't they starting with the end users of the products that they're going to manufacture? Then I was conscious that in project team meetings, each individual had their own idea of where inventory was, most of it at contractors, and there was no overall view of inventory, lot numbers, but the locations, quality status. When it came to storage and transportation, apparently that was my job as well. Everything other than the technical and the science and the clinical aspects of things was going to be my job. And I still smile to these days where one project manager, when I was talking about procurement and strategic procurement, he said, well, you're going to be in charge of shopping as well, are you? So that was a bit disconcerting. And eventually, I finished off my life in biotech working on a launch of a drug called Tarceva with Genentech in the US. And when that launched, I became an independent consultant. And I thought, gosh, I'm going to share all my skills with the world of the supply chain management that I have learned. And I had two experiences early on when I was selling my services to biotech, small virtual companies. One, both of them in Oxford. One, a CEO said, look, I'll have a meeting with you, and if I like what you hear, then you'll get some work. Through the meeting, he sort of explained to me basically I would never get any work because he was looking to make an exit. He wanted to get to a proof of concept stage, and then the supply chain was going to become someone else's fault. I also had a similar meeting with another CEO of a similar sized company, and he had exactly the same view. And as I became a consultant, I found there was little interest in the skills that I had. So I've had to actually build my profile in terms of writing and speaking and all those things that needs to happen. But in the end, I did accept the inevitable that supply chain management was not going to be a big interest for companies developing drugs as biotech companies. In 2008, 2009, the Pharmaceutical Sciences editor of Wiley in Hoboken, New Jersey, contacted me. He'd seen the training I was doing on the internet, and he said, that would quite nicely work into a book format. So would you like to write a book? And I said, yes, please. I signed the contract. And in February 2011, Supply Chain Management in the Drug Industry launched. And in the final chapter of that, I used the term serendipity-induced chronic disconnectedness with change inertia to describe how the supply chain had evolved over the previous 20, 30 years based on outsourcing and fragmentation of the supply chain. And what I'm going to talk about here is the aggregate of all that I've learned over those phases. And I'm hoping you will find that interesting and of value. So let's talk about outsourcing in pharma. In 2010 and 2011, I became very aware of outsourcing and the effect of it when I was asked to speak at in 2010, the FDA Xavier University co-sponsored global outsourcing conference. And the heparin incident that's referenced there had recently happened. It was quite raw, and there was a huge awareness of how adulteration, economic adulteration in the supply chain could cause huge issues and even death for patients. And I've just included a link to the report there. And along with that, we also began to see reports from FDA and from other news sources of similar incidents, product integrity issues. I've just put some examples down there. Some I have a link to, some I haven't because time has moved on. Security issues, again, I've linked there, all down to a supply chain that had become so fragmented that it had become more and more easy for bad actors to introduce malicious acts into the supply chain. And I'm going to talk to you a lot more about that as we go through. I'm showing these slides here so that you can read them. I won't talk specifically to the slides, but so what I will say, there was a real response to heparin and the other issues in Europe. We saw the Falsified Medicines Directive passed in 2011. We saw dramatic changes to good distribution practice and good manufacturing practice, which I'll talk about a bit later. We saw for ISIA, the Food and Drug Safety and Innovation Act passed, again, which spoke to measures to tighten up on the supply chain. We've seen various acts. We've even seen President Obama weighing in on shortages. Again, the report above for heparin was published, and GS1 published this important report, again, all hoping to help with the issues that we had seen. And I'm not going to sort of dwell too much on regulations, but this is a common technical document that, as you probably know, companies have to use when they submit to regulators to market a drug. Module 3 there at the bottom left-hand corner, that is effectively the supply chain module. And depending on how that module is populated depends on how complex or how simple and effective a supply chain is. And again, over the years, we have seen submissions of quite complex supply chains in this document. And once those supply chains are registered, it's impossible to change. It's impossible to, or virtually impossible to change, to eradicate some of the issues that may have been locked in during development. And here we see what we're all familiar with here, the elements of GMP. You see outsourced activities listed in there. And there were some changes in 2010, 2011, 2012 to reflect the importance of outsourced activities. But we also saw good distribution practice changes. Again, elements such as returns, falsified medicines, self-inspections, brokers, and those sorts of additions to the supply chain actors that we hadn't seen in the days when I first joined the industry in the early 1980s. I'm just repeating there some of the other some of the elements again that were part of the response, just to confirm there was quite a lot of response. But what I can say is, in co-chairing the FDA conference, I was aware that the regulators that were presenting, they were collaborating globally with FDA. FDA joined the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme. Certainly the head of inspections at the MHRA, I can remember sitting next to him on the bus leading up to the Xavier Conference Center. And he was saying that he had never experienced such collaboration amongst regulators. And we saw publications to help address the problems. And as I mentioned, we saw ISIA pass. So I'm just going to go through here really the changes. And again, I'm not going to read that. You can read that for yourself. But around 2011, 2012, we saw significant changes to both GMP and GDP. Uh, uh, Looking at some of the risk areas, some of the barriers to traceability, and there we have the scope of the 2011 directive. And these are some of the areas that the revised guidelines talk to. Again, the importance of the quality management system, of senior management commitment, importance of risk management, ICHQ 9, and all the things that you'd expect companies to be looking at for themselves. And particularly, we see changes in Chapter 6, Chapter 7 of the Orange Guide, again, looking to get at these issues, and specifically brokers. And my personal experience in the supply chain is that brokers can form this barrier of opaqueness that you can't get through because of the commercial requirements for brokers to keep their sources of supply secret. We saw a significant regulation tightening here, which really was putting the emphasis on companies to be able to trace all the way up their supply chain, right the way back to source. And at ISIA, I know that is chapter and verse for you. I don't have to say that, but it hasn't been, and is still not, an easy thing to do across the wider supply chain in life sciences and pharmaceuticals. So I've put some slides in there to give you an idea of what happened around the 2000 time up until 2018. Again, these are the barriers that I've found and I've listed there. So we leave it there, where the fragmentation of supply chain that I'm now going to talk to in terms of cause has left this industry finding it very difficult to deal with some of the traceability issues that we are still witnessing. So in the 1970s, early 1980s, it was all about vertical integration, local presence in the markets, mainly small molecule products. By the 2010s, we had to have a range of different business models, biologics come along, globalization, etc. And this was the supply chain pre-pharma outsourcing. We basically only had one business model, which was the large pharmaceutical companies who, like Pfizer, Merck, etc., who would be responsible for submitting NDAs, MAAs to regulators, very integrated. And they were the channel captains, if you like, for the supply chain. Now we see how it's been post-pharma outsourcing. We can see here that there's at least 6 different business models, huge contractor base. The complexity is absolutely immense. I won't go too much into that, because hopefully by comparing those two, you can see how today it's really quite difficult to gain any sort of visibility into the supply chain. And it's important we understand that R&D is at the core of these issues. Here we can see a typical virtual company developing a drug. The CMC data is required for the company, first of all, to do safety testing for the initial 5 or 10 kilos of compound. And you see there, the safety data is submitted to the sponsor company. And this is a supply chain that's purely designed to get to the endpoint of proving safety. At this point, the actors engaged in the development process will be preclinical toxicology, DMPK individuals and specialisms. And there really will be no consideration of the supply chain issues. Then we move on to, if you like, a full-scale clinical trial where efficacy data has to be submitted. And all this time, the CMC data is having to be submitted. And again, I don't experience a lot of supply chain thinking when this is going on. Most of the thinking is around developing clinical efficacy data that would inform a label claim when the product is approved. And I'm conscious I'm talking about small molecule here, serum, plasmids, etc. Really is all about biologics and upstream and downstream processing. And I'm just showing here, principally, the principles are very much the same. We start with raw materials, starting materials, cell lines, etc. And we end up with finished products that go into the distribution system. And here we see the distribution system, and this has become a characteristics of the system. The product license holders sell their products into wholesalers and the distribution network. And from then on, they are not involved in distribution or with patients or with customer complaints. It's entirely in the hands of the wholesaler. So again, gaining transparency and traceability is increasingly difficult. So I'm sort of cutting to the chase here. I'm really keen that the knowledge and skills that reside within ISIA could be leveraged in some way via traceability for the industry worldwide. The issues I've described there require the pharmaceutical companies themselves to be able to have a simple method of ensuring they know this, the one up, one down, if you like. You all know that better than me, but each company knows what it has to do in terms of being able to collaborate with other companies so that a full picture of traceability is achieved. Mark my words, that is not happening at the moment. There is very little collaboration in the supply chain that allows companies to effect proper traceability right up to original source. Now, I'm not going to teach this association to suck eggs, because you know far better than me how that would happen. What I am going to say, though, is that I think the time has come when we recognize that the lack of integration, the lack of transparency in the supply chain has to be addressed stakeholder-wide, and it has to be led by the companies who are developing and manufacturing the drugs. And that means industry associations. And that's why I'm very pleased to be speaking here today, because, as I say, having spoken to Jenny Murray and others, I realize the good work that you're doing and the potential it has to form best practices for the industry in areas where that makes sense. So I'm going to finish off with a view of a CAR T, an autologous biologic, CAR T therapy, where we see a supply chain that is a challenge to the whole industry. We see there a hospital where the patient resides with a condition, with a blood cancer, and that patient is going to be both the source and the destination of the product, which is patient's own cells. And those cells have to go through a journey of apheresis, then pick up by third-party logistics providers, cryogenic freezing, air freight, custom clearance, a whole range of processing, releases, QP releases, and it relies, that eventually arrives back at the hospital for infusion back into the patient. If the chain of identity in any way is flawed, it's instant death for the patient. So to me, this is the absolute reason that we need a solution to the problem of traceability, because the whole, in this instance, the whole wholesaler network that we currently have has to be bypassed. And that's a question the industry has to answer. So without any further ado, I'm just going to leave you with contact details if you have any questions. I hope that you found this useful. And as I said previously before, it's been a delight to speak to you all. And I'm really looking forward to being part of the proceedings that all the contributors are working on. Thank you very much.